Okay, so this music is extraordinarily loud. Okay, so I wanted to cover Infinity RV extension, and I wanted to lay out a few of the different use cases, I guess, and how to actually develop to work with this mod. So first off, I've a few videos on this. What exactly is it? It simply adds in the functionality required for Arma 3 extensions to be used in DayZ. It does have the capacity for client and server extensions. However, the real use case is for server extensions because client extensions require BattleEye disabled, and no one wants to run a BattleEye disabled server. So, this is the directory you're going to find on our Git, which is linked in the description, just like all my videos for this will be. Client, I've covered this. We use xinput as a payload. I have an example extension, and we have this add-on. Now, this add-on contains an interface. This is going to be heavily code-based, so if you don't have any knowledge in DayZ Enforce, you might be able to follow along. Even with a basic foundational knowledge of how modding in DayZ works, just the simplest knowledge, you should be able to follow along, because very little of this is going to be based in Enforce. A lot of it's going to be based in C. So this is the entire interface. What I provide in this mod is a class called Extension, which handles the calling of these proto-native functions. These can be called anywhere if you don't want to use the extension class. You can always pass in your library and then these arguments, right? All this extension class does is it gives me the ability to go in and say, you know what, here's a use case where, say they want to pass an array of integers into their RV extension args, but this takes in an array of strings. I could handle that for you in this class. That would be the basic use case of having this class. As well, there's this nice Git version, so you can do easy version checking. You don't have to do all this other stuff. You just say, oh, here's my library, I want to get the version. Done. So we have callDayZ, which is a proto-native, which is saying, hey, these objects directly correlate with native objects. And I'm going to pull open the project here as well. We return strings from these. I tried to use an out, it didn't work, whatever. Here we go. So, the connection, the way that these proto-natives actually interact with the library, the DLL that I provide as well. In here, in source files, we have callExtension. I might dive into how these extension objects are actually connected, but it's not gonna be right now. So first things first, each of the data types for RV extension are defined here. These might not be 100% accurate as to what the Arma 3 engine defines as an RV extension, but they're accurate enough to pass the data into these similar. I'm not going to say exact same because I haven't actually done any thorough testing, but in a very similar format to where most libraries should work. So we have callExtension DayZ, which is really, I don't expect anyone to use it, right? It's not going to be the use case. RV extension is well documented. RV extension already has libraries for it. DayZ extension, however, is something that I did. It was my first real implementation, and actually you can see it's very similar to the way RV extension works, except it doesn't have this output size or output or any of that. So when you're actually running one of these proto-natives, so we'll just do callRV, right, which is RV extension. So callRV runs this one, runs this function here. What it does is it pulls up your library, which if it's already been loaded, you've already called it once, it will pull the existing one out of memory, or get the address of it in memory. And if you haven't, it will load it for you. So once we have your module, we're going to pull out the RV extension export. And we construct a buffer of 255, and we pass that into RV extension. So you only get a buffer of 255 for your output. That needs to be increased, obviously, because RV extension, if we go to callExtension, you have a much larger output buffer with callExtension. You actually have 1024 bytes, right? So I will go ahead and do that now. 10 to 40. That's what you get. Yeah, that's fine. So you get this buffer, which now, as you're watching this, matches this. And it simply calls your RV extension and returns a result. There's nothing really complex about what I'm doing in here. This is how it interacts with your library, your extension. So we have X input, right? What this is, and I use, this isn't the proper term for it, but I use the term rewire because that's a project I'd worked on for a while. It does essentially this. What it does is it recreates these exports that the original X input has, and anytime that that export is called from the engine, it will pass that back into the original DLL, the one that we then load parallel. So the game gets two of these DLLs, it has access to ours, and it says, hey, I want this function, and ours says, oh, okay, here's this function, let's go to the original DLL and get the result and pass it on. It's like a little middleman between the original and the game. But what that allows us to do is it allows us to add little bits of code that we also want to run, but that we don't want to have to inject into the game. Now, the server doesn't use X input, so we do have to inject it, but just besides the point. What we do is we hook a specific function, the init modules function. Now, I obviously don't know if that's what it's called in DayZ, but what this function does is it handles initializing these proto functions. These methods in Enforce that call native code in the engine. So we hook onto that, and that actually gets passed an address, right? A pointer. That pointer, it represents, I guess, the object that Enforce, or the emulation for Enforce. I'm not too sure what that points to, because I haven't really looked into it. But that is the argument we pass into script register. The second function that we need. We only need two. Script register is a function in DayZ that registers our method. It's the pointer to our method to the engine. It's going to sound like I'm pulling a lot of this out of my ass because I really am. There isn't a whole lot of information on this. So I'm just kind of relaying what it is that I've understood up to this point. I could be misunderstanding some things. So we have our function, and this right here is simply saying a server, client, whatever. And we simply call that function with the name of our proto-native. So in this case, call DayZ, any of these, right? And the pointer to the native function, so one of these. The pointer to this function, for example. And that's it. So that registers with Enforce that, hey, whenever this is called, run this code with our parameters passed. That's just about all there is to it. So whenever the game starts up, we hook into the init modules. When that's called, it will go through and register our modules, our methods, and then it runs this ASI loader, right? I'll get into that because this is the next thing I'm going to be covering. And then it calls the original one to load what actually is supposed to be loaded. and then returns the result of what actually is supposed to return. So this ASI loader, what does this do? Well, to make it simple, because I haven't looked into it, and this is not all my code, a majority of it is not my code, at least this xinput library. But the ASI loader loads third-party DLLs of a specific format in the extensions folder based on the root folder. So to give that a bit more clarity, if you go to your DayZ folder and you create an extensions folder called extensions inside of that folder, you can then place library DLLs in there, and that will load whenever xinput is running this function, and it will see which methods you have in there, or it will allow you to register more methods than just these call extensions. So there is an example on our Git and on the original Git of how this is done. And to make it simple, this is pretty much the exact same thing you just saw in callExtension, but this is how I originally developed it, is as this third-party extension. So what this has is, pretty much nothing that looks too outside of it. You include enforce scripthook.h, right? Which I believe might be an external dependency. But what that gives us access to is script register, which is what needs to be called to register our function. So, and for example, if we were to do what I did in callExtension.cpp in a third-party module, this is all you would need. You would need access to enforce scripthook.h. You would need to define data types. These actually don't need to be defined because you could be achieving anything in here. If you wanted to do, say, I don't know, CURL, right? Char pointer URL. Make HTTP get request to URL and return result. All you would need to do is then register the script down here and add it to your own interface as a proto-native. In this case, it would be string CURL and then string URL. You don't have to match these, so I could call it proto-native string web request with string request URI in enforce. I could call it that if I wanted to, as long as the name of the method in enforce, so for example call rvargs, is what you define right here in this first string. That's it. That's the only requirement, is that those two things match, and it will work. Now there are a few other things to consider. One being data types. So example, call rvargs, right? I pass in a not null array of string called args. Now array of string is a data type in enforce. It's not a native data type. So it's what you actually get in this field here, in this parameter here, is a pointer to the array of type T structure. Now, the way I did this is I pulled open DayZ and I froze the game right whenever I got this function called. And I said, okay, here's this address. This is what I'm getting in as the address of this value. And I pulled open a memory viewer and I looked at the memory and I said, okay, let's try to find the two strings in my example code, which were arg1 and arg2, from this address. And I spent a little bit of time in there and I found that, and there's obviously a lot of ways I could have done this, is the way I did it. I found that 28 bytes off of the base pointer, so 25, if I take args and I add 28 bytes to it, in this case 0x5 times 8 gives us 0x28, I found that this points to the const char pointer that we actually need. And so deref cast it after doing that, and then I pass that in. And so what that gives me is I can go from array of what I think should be any data type, so maybe an array of int, and I should be able to pull out that data as an array. Now, RVArgs takes in an array of string, and that might be slightly differently, have a slight different structure than an array of int or an array of float. And then, of course, there comes the casting. Do I pass it into RVExtension args as an int? Do I pass it it has to go in as a string, so I'd have to cast it to a string. It's just simpler to handle it as a string, and in enforce, write any method to handle casting the data type to a string. So if you want to handle more complex objects with your extension, what I call a third-party extension, you would need to think about, okay, well, I don't know what this data type would be in native C. So I need to figure out what I need from this data. I need to look at the game and find what I need to change in order to get from this pointer that it gives me to the result that I need to use. It's obviously a lot simpler working with simple data types like char pointer. So you could always think of, okay, do I need this complex data type? Would it be easier for me to handle the complex data type, like say a class type or a vector, for example, right? Which I don't think is that complex, but who knows? I haven't looked at it. Would it just be easier to take it in enforce and convert it to simple things like ints or chars, strings, and then pass that in? These are things you'd have to consider when making your third-party library. So, developing. I want to write a third-party extension. What would I do in order to get started in doing this if I am not that experienced in C++, not experienced enough to look at this project and say, okay, I can work from this. Foundationally, what I would recommend is simply taking this example enforce extension and modifying its code to fit whatever you need done. And then that's really it. That's all I would say do. Now, you might have issues with your system, your Visual Studio instance, stuff like that. I can't really talk to. But taking this project, which does compile on my machine, and telling you that, if you aren't sophisticated enough to do this on your own, you can simply take all of this code, hit the backspace button on it. Okay, not all of it, but not these. And then simply start writing your own stuff and play around with it. And then, of course, you would only need one script register. That's what I would recommend. Now, for RVExtension, right? Let's say I wanted to make something for my server, right? My server, I want to be able to report to a website some data. I don't know, how many, they say people trading money. I don't know. Any data. I couldn't really name one specific use case, but I don't really need, in Battle Royale, right? Because I can give you a use case here. At the end of the match, I need to report who won, who lost, and other data about that, right? I need to report that to some database to store this. Now, DayZ stores live characters. So when I kill them, is there a way to store that in DayZ's database? I don't know. But I do know for a fact that I can store that on a web database if I have CURL or any sort of web request functionality on my server. As well, I can then access that web database to display stuff on a website. So, here are the leaderboards. So what would I do? Well, I would write an extension, an RVExtension. I would take this Infinity RVExtension mod, and you'd run it side by side. I'd run it side by side with DayZBR. Because it doesn't mod any of the default or any of the DayZ engine stuff, it can run side by side with any mod and it won't interact with it, unless that mod uses class extension, in which case it will, but besides that, it should not have any other interaction with it. So I'll run this mod side by side, and I'll install only the server side. So the client still has the mod, it still has the extension class, it still has the proto-native functions. But there's no mapping from those proto-natives to the engine to any DLL. So if the client, for some odd reason, called it, it wouldn't do anything. Now I would code DayZ so that I'd say, okay, here's a server request at the end of the match, call extension, and do this. And I would use RV extension. And of course, RV extension has so many documents, you don't even need me to explain how it's done. This is almost a word-for-word copy and paste from the wiki. So here's DayZ extension, and here's all the other RV extension stuff. That's all I would do. I would just word for word from the wiki, I'd say, okay, what do I need to do? And I'd implement it that way. So, server implementation, right? Server starter.exe. This is going to be an issue for a little bit. Eventually, I will have just a standard DLL that you place in your DayZ server directory and it'll work. But for now, you need server starter. Okay, so we install server starter and we add this RV extension as a dependency for whatever mod we're making. I'll continue the DayZ mod for the rest of the video. So I install RV extension for DayZ as a dependency on the workshop. So whenever a client downloads BR, they also have to download RV extension and they have to launch them together. Okay. So now I have my server set up, and I guess we can go. Go in here. So we have my server set up. We have server starter. We have all this cool stuff. We have RV extension, battle royale. Very cool. I would then write my library for doing whatever requests I need to do. And whenever I'm running my server, I just run my server using the server starter. Do I not have the server launcher? I guess I don't. Oh, I'm in the DayZ client. Oh, we are. I'd then run the server starter. So that's all there is to it, right? It's simply in terms of the client, it's simply a copy paste and have the client copy and paste this library to the directory and use this mod. For the server, it's simply copy this executable in this library to the directory and run this mod. If you want to integrate it with your mod, add RV extension as a dependency on the workshop, and when you're running your server starter.exe and the library. And the source code is all available on our Git, so if you want to make changes or compile them yourself, you're free to do so. If you want to fork, make improvements, or whatever, it's all up there. So that's really all there is to it in terms of developing extensions, these mForce extensions, right? Like I said, if you want to add, say, your own proto-native for CURL, you would simply add a folder in here called extensions, and you would take your compiled library and you drop it in there, and then our Xinput would load that, map your proto-native in the engine, and then a mod very similar to with an interface very similar to ours, right? Simply a mod with a proto-native in 3-game, and you're good to go. So, I mean, that's about it for this video. If you have any questions, I guess you can. I wouldn't comment on the video. Just I don't really respond to comments much. But you can message me on Discord. That's probably where you'll find the video anyway. I don't know if I'm probably not going to have this on Workshop, but if I do, hey. But that's about it. Yeah. Again, everything for callExtensions on this wiki. I am trying as hard as I can to make DayZ interact with extensions in the exact same way Arma 3 does. So if you find an extension that doesn't work. Say you're tfar, right? You're working on adding tfar's library to DayZ, which I looked at and I thought that'd be pretty funny. But say you have an extension as complex as tfar's is, and you're like, hey, this RV extension call is not working the way it does in Arma 3. You know, you've double checked your enforce code. You know for a fact that the DLL is getting the exact same data that Arma 3 is getting, but you're getting a different result. You know, that's the kind of case where it's like, okay, well, there's something wrong with how we are interacting with RV extension, and that's where I'm going to go in, update the libraries, update the Git, and fix it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Java's ransomware, by the way. With that, I guess it's time to end the video. Thanks, guys. I will probably have a few more videos on this coming out. I want to cover specific implementations of extensions, and I want an operational server with an extension so you guys can kind of interact with it. So yeah, we're already pushing 26 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. Bye.